Clap. All right. Well, welcome to LERA's 74th annual conference for those of you that are just joining us. My name is Michael Loconto. I am a labor arbitrator from Boston, Massachusetts, and I've been a member of LERA dating back to 2006. And I've been an attendee at a number of these conferences in the past, and it's my pleasure to host some emerging research once again from the PhD realm all across our institutions supporting the organization. So we have a panel today on organized voice, and this is for folks keeping track of this. It's the LERA Best Papers session number 3. This is session 3.6, and I'm going to go through some brief introductions of the panel. And then we will lead it off with John Ahlquist and his presentation, and then into Deb Moy. And if there are any other folks that are with us that would like to follow on with questions, we can save that to the end. You're certainly welcome to enter those in the chat if you prefer not to ask live, or you can certainly raise your hand and we can call on anyone interested in asking any questions at the end. So first up, we have John Ahlquist from the University of California at San Diego, who will be presenting on employee hardship funds as mutual aid, private welfare, unionization, and social insurance. And that'll be followed by Deb Moy from California Transit Works with her presentation, It's Our Work, empowering frontline worker voice for unionized coach operators. And I do want to make a quick note, Deb will be leading a presentation with frontline workers from the transit industry on Saturday morning at 11:15 in another breakout session. So I'd encourage all of you with interest in this topic to join at that time. And I just want to take one further note. Unfortunately, our third presentation that had been scheduled for this panel cannot make it today. One of our presenters is feeling under the weather, and the other is on a parental leave. This was a team presentation, but I want to give credit to Yao Yao of the University of Ottawa and Lorenzo Frangi of the University of Québec at Montreal with their Digital Solidarity Worker Collectives in the Virtual Space presentation. Those materials will be available on the LERA website following the presentation for your review. So with that, John, you can take it away, and please feel free to share your screen.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks to both you and Deb for joining us virtually here. I look forward to your comments. So this is a very early stage project. Let me just say that. This is, I would say, the pilot phase of what I was hoping was going to be a longer project, but based on the output from the pilot study that I'm going to describe to you, I'm at kind of a decision moment about whether and how to proceed with this line of research. And so I'm really looking forward to comments from everybody to kind of help guide my thinking about how this might continue. So I'm going to work on the assumption that you have never heard of an employee hardship fund. I had not heard of them until a couple of years ago when I encountered them in the conversation, and I found them really interesting. So I found them really interesting from both a social science perspective, as just kind of organizations and organizational history, as well as from a worker rights and quality of jobs and delivering of services to often underpaid or mistreated workers in the United States. So I'm not going to go too much into the theory, so to speak, but I'll highlight a few ideas that are informing how I'm thinking about this. And then if you have other suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But I think we're all familiar, at least with some of the basics of labor history, about how mutual aid organizations of a variety of types and forms were really kind of the proto-organizations in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, elsewhere in the world, for workers to try to mitigate the changes and threats and risks of the emerging industrial production system. And they took the form of, people getting together, donating money, resources, time, et cetera, into some sort of pool that would then be distributed in the event of something bad happening, whether it's death or injury or sickness or something like that. They formed an important part of the growth and development of early labor unions. Some of the successes and failures of various mutual aid funds on various scales also ended up provoking government involvement in different countries, some of which turned into kind of early social welfare and social benefit programs. And in the current environment, as we're seeing unions atrophy social insurance and the investment and capacity of the American social insurance and social welfare system atrophy, we're seeing renewed interest in a variety of domains for new forms of mutualist organizations or mutual aid. So I think that's just a little bit by way of backdrop. So what then are employee hardship funds? I found them really puzzling, coming from some of the background I just described in political science and economics and history and sociology, to discover that in the United States, there have emerged, like over the last couple of decades, and there's really no data in this space. Let me just start by saying that. And there's no academic literature that I've been able to discover. And there's a very modest practitioner literature. Employers have now started to develop employer managed, employer organized hardship funds for their own workers, in which employers may put in some money, they may not, it's not totally clear, but they're designed to take donations, money donations from workers. They technically can take them from anybody, but they're generally taking them from their own workers into a fund that then pays out some sort of benefit, cash grant benefit, to those workers in the event of some sort of what's called a qualified emergency in the language of or qualified event in the language of the IRS. It's worth noting that the donations into these funds are tax advantaged under the US tax code. That holds for both firms and for workers themselves to the extent they can take deductions. And it also, the payouts, these cash grants, are tax exempt. The IRS took a very dim view of programs like this for a long time, but there was some change around the law and the interpretation in the early 2000s. And so now it appears that there are a substantial number of these employee hardship funds or EHFs. They're often in industries and with employers that aren't necessarily known for paying high wages, having worker protections, having good fringe benefits and that sort of thing. So often they're showing up in retail. In fact, all of the largest, except for one of the largest 25 retailers in the United States, appear to have some version of these programs. In terms of how old they are, how big they are, what they get, how they're administered, all this kind of stuff, as best I can tell, there is extreme variation. Let's just leave it at that. And I'm happy to tell you what I know. But there's the size of the grants are highly variable, whether they're administered as a separate 501c3 or somehow through the firm itself varies. Whether you have to get a manager's permission to apply depends, and so forth. The last thing I'll just say is there, as I've mentioned, virtually no literature on these funds at all. There's a little bit of practitioner literature. I can describe some of the details there, but I think it has some pretty severe limitations. Just to give you a feel for the scale of this. So there is a little bit of a cottage industry in this space where there are third-party entities that I think are typically organized as some sort of nonprofit that basically take on the kind of design and management of these funds, and then, excuse me, on behalf of large firms. And this is just an example of one that I found with the logos of a bunch of their clients. And this is obviously in alphabetical order. I was able to get through D, but there's a whole bunch of them on here. So that's a little bit of background. What am I trying to do and what are my interests here? I'll say I have kind of descriptive goals and kind of more social science hypothesis driven goals. The descriptive goals are really driven by the fact that we know almost nothing. There are some reports that describe kind of interviews or focus groups with a select number of workers who have apparently received actual grants, but from different firms, and asking them kind of what effect this had on their lives. But in terms of systematic questions to workers about their awareness of these funds, whether they've applied for them, whether they know anyone who's applied for them, whether they've actually received a grant, et cetera, appears to be totally unknown. And so I'm going to try to address at least some of that. And then there are some kind of hypothesis-driven things. In particular, do the presence of these funds have any effect on anything at all? So you might imagine that people in firms that offer these funds, to the extent they're aware of them or take advantage of them, might view themselves as having better financial stability in the sense that they can better meet emergency expenses. They might think more favorably of their coworkers because this is like a mutual aid program where they're donating and their coworkers are donating. So to the extent they understand that, they might think of their employer or their coworkers in a more favorable light. But there's also this alternative literature that's, I think, still developing. It's the broad findings, I think, are still coalescing, but there's at least hints that in certain circumstances or certain types of programs, privately offered or privately funded, call it self-insurance, in the form of, say, home ownership or large savings or employer granted benefits, can have the effect of crowding out support for other forms of collective action or social welfare. And that could include things like support for unionization. It could also include support for government provided social insurance or social welfare programs. So I'm looking at them from the perspective of, is it the case that something like an employee hardship fund could have, again, not saying that employers necessarily design them this way, but could have the effect of depressing support for unionization or have a knock-on effect of undermining support for government programs that provide things like unemployment insurance. So that's where I'm coming from here. So how do you go about doing this? And my overarching program here was to try to develop a survey that I could administer to people matched to their employers. And I was going to choose a selection of firms across industry that would display some variation in the presence of these funds, how long the funds have been around, how generous they are in terms of the largest grant that they offered, and then the industry of employment. So that's the kind of the broad project I'm hoping to engage in. In this particular paper, as a pilot, with the resources I do have, I'm not going to go across all these firms and so forth. I'm going to focus on one particular firm to get a sense for what I find there, and then try to use that to figure out whether I want to continue to these other firms, and if so, how. So I'm gonna focus on one firm, and I'll say it. It's not in print. It's not a secret or anything like that. But the firm I'm looking at is the Home Depot. I'm not putting that in writing at the moment, but we can talk about it today. The way I'm going to approach this is I'm going to prompt a random subset of respondents in a survey with information about this program, and I'm going to see what effect, if any, that prompt or that stimulus has on a series of outcomes. I'll tell you more about the survey in a second, but fielded this survey through September and the middle of October last year. Part of the challenge here, and I think part of the reason why it's hard to study this, is because it's really hard to develop surveys of workers matched to specific firms. So what I'm doing here is I'm following Schneider and Hartnett. You may be familiar with the Shift project, and they've built a big infrastructure that uses Facebook to target ads to people based on where Facebook thinks they work. And you can do that. And so what this does do is it kind of limits the universe of firms you can look at. You're going to really only target very, very large employers that have a sufficient number of people that might take a survey. But they've done this in the retail sector pretty broadly and gotten some pretty reasonable results. I'm following the same strategy. It's worth noting that in the ad to try to recruit people into the survey, I am offering to raffle off an iPad mini. So this is in some sense incentivized. There's a ton of questions about selection into a sample like this. I'm happy to talk to you about that. I will say that we are using survey weights that weight responses back to Facebook reported demographics of age gender buckets. But there's obviously more issues there that I can discuss. And we were ultimately able to pull in 515 completed surveys using this strategy. So a good number, but not a huge number. And I think there are some reasonable questions you might have about this sample. So I'll tell you more about the questions in a second, but I mentioned there is an experiment in this survey. So we're trying to get a feel for the effect of reminding or prompting people about the program their employer has, not the effect of getting a grant in this program. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for this, but I think the key reason is most people aren't going to get grants or even apply for them. Most people, to the extent these programs are effective, it would be in their knock-on effects about beliefs, related to financial stability, their coworkers, et cetera. So this is, we had a control group that saw nothing at all about this program. And then, so that's a third of the sample. And then another third of the sample saw this text treatment that's very dry, factual, boring information that describes, in this case, the Home Depot's employee hardship fund, which is known as the Homer Fund. So all the stuff in brackets would be filled in with the Home Depot relevant information. And the Home Depot has a maximum of $10,000 per incident in their employee hardship fund grant program. So this is what you would see if you were in the text treatment. Now, this is all dry, pretty boring. It so happens that part of the reason I chose the Home Depot as my pilot is that they also have, this is one of the oldest employee hardship funds. It's one of the most generous. And as best we can tell, they do a lot at the Home Depot to market and advertise and make their employees aware of this fund. They have a whole website for it. They have a whole suite of video testimonials around this program. And so what we did is we took advantage of these video testimonials, and a random third of the treatments saw a short video produced by the Home Depot about the Homer Fund. And so I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing, but I am going to at least attempt to show you the first 30 seconds of it so you can get a feel for what this looks like. So can you see this video, or is it still on the slides? You can see the video. Great.
I was a medic in the Army for over 20 years. I'm retired from there, and I've been with Home Depot for about 6 years. When I first heard about the Homer Fund 4 months after I got the job, it's a fund that is available to all associates. And I thought that was great. You know you're going to be taking care of the person next to you, or a person hundreds and hundreds of miles away that you've never seen.
So if you would like to see the full thing, I'm happy to send you the link to it. It's a very highly produced, well-made video, very emotionally engaging and so forth. So these are the treatments we presented with people. And so what I'm going to do, there's a bunch of other stuff in the background in terms of regressions and the rest that I can tell you about, but I'm just going to show you some basic results from this preliminary survey and this initial survey experiment. So the first thing is, the awareness of this fund. How aware were people in the sample of this fund? Do workers even know about these things? And in this sample, we actually found that at least at a very thin level, it seems like the workers are quite aware of the existence of something like an emergency cash grant program. We asked the workers in a couple different ways. So one thing we did is, of the control group conditions that didn't get any information, we just gave them a question directly about whether their employer has a program like this, and they said yes or no. And of that group, 81% said yes, which is correct. Now, we also asked everybody a broader question that asked them to, from a list of benefits they have through their job at the Home Depot, what benefits do they have access to? And one of those responses is cash grants to help in times of emergency. So of the broader sample, 61% correctly selected that number. So either way, between 61% or 81%, that's pretty high awareness if you want to, believe that. I will say that of the control group that answered of that 81% of the control group that correctly answered the question, a third of them actually answered the other question incorrectly. And so part of that, I think, is because we used the name Homer Fund in the question we asked of the control group. So I think they're aware of the name of the program, but they may not have a very deep understanding of what it actually does. In terms of the things that are predictors of awareness in the data, The only things we really found as meaningful predictors were tenure with the firm. And so for, workers who've been there for 3 years or longer were much more likely to correctly report awareness. And whether they worked full-time was another major predictor. And those two things are obviously highly correlated. So we're interpreting this as pretty widespread but thin awareness of the Homer Fund among these workers. In terms of financial security, and I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs like this that are just going to be percents of the relevant treatment groups with 95% confidence intervals around them. There's the control group, the group that saw just that plain, boring text statement, and then the group that saw the video that you saw a clip of. What do we see? And somewhat surprisingly, we basically see nothing here. In terms of one, we have a couple different measures of financial security, but this is the standard, can you cover a $400 emergency expense, which is kind of exactly what the Homer Fund is designed to help with. And we don't really seem to get much of anything with respect to our experiment in the survey. If you look at attachment to their coworkers, and this is a pattern we're going to see repeated across most of the remaining outcomes. This is just how loyal do you feel towards your coworkers. We're going to see nothing really with respect to the boring text treatment. But we are going to see a substantial and positive, in this case, impact of the video treatment. So the kind of more intense corporate propaganda, if you want to call it that, does seem to produce a positive effect on attachment to coworkers. Just giving people boring information about the program doesn't seem to do much of anything relative to the control group. And so in this case, you'll see it really pushes down the none at all. So this is a scale of, level of attachment, increases the group in the a lot of attachment or a lot of loyalty, and pushes down everything else in this particular case. And again, if we put this in a regression context, we get the same results, but I'm just going to show you these images. Same thing with attachment to employer. We see a significant increase in the positive attachment to the Home Depot as an employer in a couple different measures, but concentrated among those in the video treatment group, not the text treatment group. This little spike here for the text treatment group doesn't really cross standard uncertainty thresholds. Support for unionization. So I'm hypothesizing that these types of funds might have some sort of negative impact on whether workers support unionization. This was really interesting and somewhat puzzling to me. My hypothesis is it would be a negative effect here. The overall sample is pretty anti-union, with about 40% or about 45% of the overall sample on average saying they would vote no if asked to vote for the union in a representation election. But what we see here in terms of the EHF treatment effect is we see that the video treatment, so the text treatment again does nothing. The video treatment has a negative impact on both the against the union and the for the union reporting, and pushes people into being unsure about whether they would vote for the union. So there's a bunch of kind of ex post stories I could tell about that, but in any event, I found it pretty remarkable and pretty interesting that this is what we find on the unionization side, an increase in uncertainty around the union. And on the support for unemployment insurance side, we actually find a significant increase in support for, the question is, should the government be responsible for helping to support the unemployed? And those in the video treatment become more supportive of government unemployment insurance relative to the control group. Again, with no real discernible consistent pattern with the text treatment group. So that's the basic overview of the findings I have in this pilot study. So let me quickly just sum up and throw a few questions at you guys to the extent you have thoughts. That in this preliminary example, we seem to see high but thin awareness of the program at this one company. Providing neutral factual stimulus information about the program doesn't really seem to do much of anything in terms of moving opinions or thoughts about what things should be going on. But this stronger kind of propaganda video does seem to show significant effects, although we have no idea how persistent or important those effects will turn out to be. And the real question I'm left with is, how should I be thinking about it and interpreting this? The challenge, one of the main challenges, if I wanted to go and try this at other firms, those other firms don't have these highly produced propaganda videos that I can immediately grab onto. And I'm showing very little effect of this kind of neutral text approach. So how can I think about this in terms of how to take this project forward? Is there a different way to think about EHFs? Have you guys seen or experienced anything around programs like this? And can you give me some suggestions there? So that's a little bit over 15 minutes. I apologize, but hopefully that's enough for you guys to react to. So thank you.
Well, thanks, John. And thank you for going on a little bit longer and filling some of the time that we've got here. I want to make sure Deb has equal amount of time. So we've got a couple minutes for questions before we hit the half-hour mark. And, you know, one thing that occurred to me in listening to the presentation and reviewing your materials is sort of on the question of, you know, what to look at next. And I wondered whether in your travels, you took a look at anything like sick leave banks that employees can donate to as support for their coworkers. And secondly, excuse me, I wonder also whether fully employer-funded funds, if that makes sense, it creates any indicia of higher levels of unionization. I'm thinking back to two experiences I've had in my career where with the presence of a strong legacy union, there's been employer-funded housing trust funds created. I know one's down at Yale, created by Local 34 and 35. And there's another one at the city of Boston where I worked early in my career that was created by the municipal workers, AFSCME union. So I tossed that out briefly.
Thank you. I'm happy to react, but if there's any other comments or questions, I'd prefer to let them arise.
Well, I actually had
Yep.
I'm just curious in your introduction, these are funds that employers can put money into as well as employees.
Yes.
And both contributions are tax deductible, and then both are tax exempt when they're withdrawn.
Yes, there's there's like an IRS document around this, and then there's one kind of tax lawyer who wrote a short kind of primer around them. It's several years old at this point. But yeah, the donations are tax deductible, and how that translates into the corporate tax structure is not totally clear to me. But they are tax advantaged for the corporation as well. But the grants to the workers are tax exempt.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike unemployment insurance benefits, for example, which in California, and I think every state, are taxable
Right.
income.
So the incentive for employers to setting these up outside of some of the hypotheses you have is a financial one as well? That's my question. First, the question that came up to my mind when you started talking about
maybe, but it doesn't seem to be that big, and it doesn't seem to be like these are huge things where employers are parking tons and tons of cash for some tax purpose. The idiosyncratic vibe I get is that many of these things were started on pretty localized levels, and some of them were very well intentioned. Like the actual history is after the 9/11 attacks, a bunch of banks and everything wanted to be able to give money to their workers who might have been affected in the New York or DC region. Right. And Congress passed a law that said, okay, you can do this. And that's kind of what changed that allowed these things to grow. Mm-hmm. And some of them have started up as a result of like a CEO, a hurricane hit Houston and the corporate headquarters are in Houston and they wanted to do something. And this was one thing they could do. And so it seems to be kind of a string of stories kind of like that. That's my best story. I've talked to a couple managers of these funds to try to get a feel for how they think about it or how they are managing it. And the ones I've talked to all very much take the attitude of they're like working for a charity and they're doing good in the world and they're helping people in hard times. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's the best answer I can give you on that.
Interesting. Thanks.
Just to quickly respond to Michael's points. I mean, the sick leave banks are a really interesting one. I haven't looked at those directly and I haven't compared them directly. In terms of the union or union adjacent hardship or mutual aid funds, part of the overarching research design was I was going to actually try to select firms that had vary some firms by unionization status. And in particular, there were a couple in the logistics industry world where one where the Teamsters maintained a kind of emergency fund type thing. And I know some other unions have done that in the past to try to see if there's any variation there or if the presence of a union managed or whatever fund makes a difference. But I haven't actually done that work. And the sick leave bank is an interesting way to go.
There are also some unions that have union hardship funds that are administered either through the union or through labor councils. And so I think it's an interesting question overall in terms of placing your research question on employer funded ones in that context of the overall constellation of what kind of funds there are.
Have you seen anybody writing about the union ones that I could look up?
I'm sorry?
Have you encountered or read anything where people have been writing up the stuff about how the union funds work or how they're perceived that I could build on?
I can check. I don't know in particular if anybody's done any research papers on them. I know of several of those funds. And in a previous life, I actually used to be a union community counselor for San Francisco County. So when we ran these kinds of union counselor programs, and one of which were these kinds of funds that people could or couldn't access depending on their workplace. So that's partly why I'm familiar with them, is because I know some unions had direct hardship funds that they worked out in various formats and some did not. And so then the question then became how they could share those. Some in Santa Clara County, they used to share it through a hardship fund through their local labor council. I don't know other counties. And that program, I'm dating myself, a number of years ago. So where they are right now, I have no idea, but I do know that at one point in time, there had been quite a big push for labor community services to have these kinds of programs in place, fully understanding that referring people to social services wasn't going to be enough, that cash assistance was going to be needed. So,
right. And that's kind of what was making sparked my interest in these things, because it does. I'm aware of the existence of those types of things kind of in the background. The detail, obviously not as much, but the fact that an employer was funding it and setting it up and managing it seemed just weird and odd and worth especially again for places that are very anti-union, that don't pay really the best wages or benefits. So I don't want to dig into Deb's time. I guess the couple questions I would pose and points I'll make just for color. The first one is, both of you mentioned these types of funds, but they tend to be associated with public sector workers and public sector unions. Do you think that's the case? And are there private sector versions that you can think of? And while you're chewing on that, I'll just say that several of these funds emerged. So Amazon, for example, started an employee hardship fund with $25 million of Amazon money in the middle of the COVID pandemic, right as all the unionization of the warehouse and fulfillment centers was starting to really ramp up, and they were getting all kinds of negative press about how they were handling workplace safety and the rest for their warehouse workers. I'm going to believe that was not coincidental, but it's interesting to see what's happening in that kind of through that lens, I guess is what I'm saying. So this is part of where my interest is coming from, but it's not clear to me how much I'm really going to be able to point at this stage.
Very timely and interesting, John. Thanks so much. Deb, you can take it away.
Sure. Let's get to share screen. See if I can manage to get this to work. This one. Can you see that? Okay.
Looking good.
My research question for this presentation is, it's our work empowering frontline worker voice for unionized coach operators. I didn't start out working in the transit industry. I actually started out working, coincidentally, Michael, you said 2006 was your first LERA. 2006 was my first as well in San Diego. And at that point, I was presenting on labor management partnerships in the hospitality industry. So I have quite a broad span of different industries in which I've been looking at this question. But in general, my research inquiry has always been looking at the special knowledge that frontline workers have, and how do you actually elevate that voice into daily field operations. And when I say daily field operations, that's a key indicator, because it's not tell us your opinion, let's have a focus group, let's do a suggestion box, none of those kind of things, but where it actually has an actual impact day to day is the kind of question that I'm looking at. I have been working in public transit. Ed Watt jumped on and jumped off. I'm sorry. I was hoping he'd stay on. But public transit is an essential industry, as I'm sure from COVID you understand. The role of essential workers was quite elevated over the last few years. But the somewhat ironic joke that everybody has is we've been essential workers forever, but you just discovered us in the last 2 years as a public inquiry. So that's basically a little bit of a framework on there. But public transit itself as an essential industry has really piqued my interest because of the particular role that it plays directly to the health and well-being of communities. And the factors here, equity, climate, and jobs, I'll come back to in a moment. That's actually a framework that we've developed in the state of California to look at worker voice in the state of California as it relates to workforce development. But for now, I'll just go through these 3 points. From the community point of view, the primary ridership in public transit, while people try to, in various cities, accommodate a wide variety of riderships, the biggest ridership, as you can see, especially through COVID, was for low-income, disadvantaged communities and communities what they call priority populations in California, which has also an environmental impact to them. And I did a survey, a painstaking zip code survey of thousands of people on where they lived and who worked for Frontline agencies in public transit in California, and discovered that more than 50% of California's entry-level workers come from these same communities. So it's a very unique industry in that sense because it's not only providing those jobs to folks from those communities, but it's also serving essential needs of those communities as well. So that's an important point to remember just in terms of the uniqueness of this industry compared to others that I've worked in the past. The other big trend, at least in California, but also nationally, is that's the big push to go to zero-emission vehicles. So in California, it's called the Innovative Clean Transit Initiative, ICT 2040. All public transit agencies in California, which is thousands of buses, are all supposed to convert to zero emission by 2040. Right. Anybody here have an electric car? You know how easy that is to convert a lot of things over. So it's a big shift. But it also means for workers a really huge shift in terms of the type of work that they do. So that is a particular role of public transit. And I am looking in particular at unionized jobs as good paying jobs with benefits and career ladders. And I'll talk some more about that in a moment. For frontline workers, then, they have that unique window, if you will. They come from the community, they're serving that community, and they can see exactly what's working and what's not working. So if any industry was going to be ripe for worker voice and wanting to be able to have worker voice incorporated into their day-to-day operations, you would think that that would be public transit. But there are certain inhibitors, if you will, to that role. Is there actually a role? Public transit, unlike other, similar to other public sector, runs in a very traditional top-down hierarchical management system. Where workers are not really given that role. Sometimes they're referred to as drones, sometimes they're referred to as cogs. When you look in the literature, you'll see both academic and popular, management literature, you'll see this type of hierarchical management system referenced as the old style, but it's still a pretty predominant style in public sector, especially in transit. The particular thing of transit, though, if you think about it, do any of you ride public transit by any chance? Or ever rode public transit in Boston? And yeah, Boston, I'm very familiar with the public transit system there. I used to live there. So, and John, I don't know where you took public transit, but transit systems are very complex. There's so much to running it that just the pure logistics of running a transit system can keep managers and supervisors so busy, they don't really even have time physically to go and sit with workers and talk to them in what we would consider a normal, manager, supervisor, and worker relationship. So relationships in this sense, in some ways, get drowned out by just the sheer enormity of the task of running a transit system. For the coach operator, and I'm using coach operator in particular because most people think of it as the Ralph Cramden bus driver. and y'all have to admit, and then we're dating ourselves again, but that's what you usually call it. Driver this, driver that, bus driver this. And everybody's view of a bus driver is you drive a bus from A to B and you go back and forth between the same 2 points and life is good, right? But actually, it's a lot harder job. And this is really where digging into worker voice and being able to appreciate this has really come to national focus. When you dig into what a coach operator actually does, these are the kinds of things they don't have control over. You can't control who gets on and off your bus. You can't control your weather. This is a nod to Boston. I arrived in Boston 3 weeks before the blizzard of '78, and so I learned a lot about what it meant to have environmental, particularities. But if you think about that, driving all day in traffic with unpredictable people in whatever environment that you're working in, hills, weather, etc., is very difficult. You're working alone. Bus drivers do not work in pairs. It's not like you have pilots where you have a pilot and a co-pilot where you can relieve each other. Insufficient silver skills training means that the usual way that drivers get trained is you'll get your technical training, how to operate the bus, what are the schedules, what are the rules. That might take anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the agency. You're so busy learning that, you don't have a lot of time to learn how to handle what I just talked about. How do you handle passengers? What happens when you're late? What do you do with this or that? Responsibility without authority, I think, is a typical service worker. If you look in any other industry, you're expected to give great customer service, but you don't actually have any authority to change anything or to affect your working conditions. And then from a labor management point of view, then you can see that drivers become caught between a very demanding public at times and a management strategy, which is basically called threat of discipline. Do this or else you'll get written up. Do this or else something will happen. So from that point of view, you'd almost wonder why anybody wants to be a coach operator, but you can see from the point of view of serving your community how much people really care about what they do. So they really are caught in that bind as well. So I started this research 17 years ago, so I've been at this for a while. I've been 17 years at one particular agency, and I've since brought this to scale across the state of California, and we're also starting to bring it across nationally as well, and I'll talk about that later. So you could call it participatory action research, you could call it appreciative inquiry research, you could call it strictly quantitative. There's a lot of things you call it in terms of research methodology. My particular methodology comes from the point of view of wanting to understand worker voice, as I said earlier. So I try to set up the research questions more along those lines. And the 3 factors, just going quickly to a summary, these are the 3 factors that I have found that if you really want to effectively bring worker voice out in a really complex industry like public transit, are the 3 factors. Workplace safety in multiple dimensions, having processes that effectively center worker voice in training and operations, and then processes that transform worker leadership and empower worker voice. You have to consciously look at those 3 factors, or you're not really going to get a full worker voice participation in the ways that is possible. I just want to reference, in doing these findings, I should go back for a moment, in doing these findings, it took more than a year for the initial group. I've done a bunch of research projects at this particular agency and across different agencies over the last 17 years, but these findings became out of the very first group I did. I did 150 focus groups. I'm sorry, I don't have slides on this. I was trying to keep it short. I had 150 focus groups with 232 people. They're all frontline workers, either at the front line on the street or superintendents and levels of supervision in that sense, all related to the operations side of transportation. So it was a pretty good sample size. What I did was to ask, I would like a representative sample from various job classifications across every classification in operations that touched the street. So it was a pretty extensive research project, took me about a year. And so that's where these 3 factors come from, and they definitely have been borne out by taking it to scale as well. On the multiple dimensions of workplace safety, saying you're going to have worker voice and putting workers in a room and saying, okay, tell us what you think, is just not going to work, especially in the conditions that we just talked about. The physical safety, in fact, just before this presentation, I was dealing with this even now. When are you having these? Are you having it too close to somebody's work shift? Not being aware of those kinds of considerations is going to tank whatever effort you do. And I've seen a lot of researchers do things that are convenient to them for timing. It's not convenient at all for the workers. And so they're either half asleep, stressed out about getting to work, or something has just happened, or the physical accommodations just don't lend themselves to people feeling safe. Are you asking them these questions in front of coworkers who might be butting in, if you will, on what it is they have to say, or they might be ridiculed? Are you doing it in front of, this just happened last week, actually. Due to COVID, we had to change the location of some, what was supposed to be neutral focus groups. So they couldn't meet in the meeting room they were supposed to meet in, so they met in a bus. Well, that would seem like it's confidential, but if you're in the middle of a hot location, you need to turn the bus air conditioning on. When you turn the bus air conditioning on, guess what else goes on? The recording and the cameras and the microphones that are on every bus. So now it's no longer confidential because now you've got a recording, right? That's not authorized. So paying attention to that physical safety first and foremost is really important. The second one on safety from retaliation or from discipline, we had to actually put in a number of protocols to guarantee, and we put these in writing between labor and management, that these are the protocols in which we're going to be able to do these kinds of groups. We had a Vegas rule, popularly called a Vegas rule, which had to do with confidentiality, that what said in the room stayed in the room, actually was a great benefit for both labor and management, because a lot of times management just wants to explore options as well, and they don't want it to get out to everybody either. So being able to have that kind of protocol. There was a protocol between discipline. If somebody made a mistake and they admitted it in a neutral group, they don't want to walk out of the hallway and get slapped with a 3-day suspension because they made a mistake and they wanted to talk about it, what to do differently. So that was a pretty tough one, but we were able to negotiate that between labor and management, that there would be a firewall from discipline. And then in general, the principles of psychological safety or psychological workplace safety that Amy Edmondson has been pioneering for all these years have all come into play in terms of workplace safety here. My point mainly being, though, is that if you don't start with making things safe for people first, you will not get the kind of worker voice that we really need to dig out. The second one is on processes that effectively center worker voice, particularly in training and operations. Here's where having a joint labor management partnership and a workforce intermediary, as it's popularly called, really came into play. Unless we set up these very careful environments, as you can imagine, given the scenario I laid out earlier, it was pretty antagonistic between labor and management. Michael, you've been an arbitrator, you understand how this works. That when you have these high tension workplaces like this, basically what's going to end up happening is that you're going to end up with, when I first started there, hundreds of thousands of dollars in arbitrations. The way you solve things was through grievance and arbitration. You didn't sit down and have a discussion on anything. So the labor and management in this case used my research findings to come to the agreement that they could try to have a partnership. And that's the key thing, right? Then they spent the next few years trying to figure out how to do that. So the role of the researcher, myself in this case, then actually became a third-party neutral. So the primary work that I did of the partnership became the third party to do focus groups, to be able to facilitate meetings with workers, to facilitate meetings with management. That process, what we have found as we brought it to scale, becomes really important. The quality of the labor management partnership is going to determine the ability of worker voice to come out in the ways that I'm looking at it. The particular thing that I bring to this, again, that's different, say, from the traditional, I've been traditionally trained in the FMCS problem-solving mode, and I've done that for a number of years in other industries. What I've done differently here in transit was to look at strengths-based organizational development versus this kind of deficit problem-solving mode. Because I find the problem-solving mode, they might work out between labor and management an agreement, a negotiated agreement of what could be possible. But what's missing then is the creativity and the spirit of what could we do different? What could be better? What could we do completely new? And so those ideas usually don't come out very well when you're mainly focused on fixing a problem. Like, how do we get, from the hospitality point of view, how do you get 26 job classifications down to 6? That can be like a problem solving, so you're solving a problem, but it doesn't really imagine a different way that work could be done. So in taking that strengths-based approach, we had a lot of great outcomes, which I'll talk about in a moment. The third element is finding processes that transform workplace leadership and empower worker voice. The interesting thing about this agency is from the research findings that I presented earlier, the X number of focus groups and lots of workers, that only got the partnership so far. It didn't actually still tap into that kind of worker voice that was there. So we went back and did another set of focus groups. And in this case, we chose one particular yard. So to John's point, how do you find that one location? In this case, we decided not to do the entire operations of this transit agency. We chose one bus yard. It happened to be the largest bus yard. And I asked them to give me representative focus groups of workers that were chosen by labor and management, the people that were known for getting the work done, not who had the best attendance record, not who had, you know what I mean, but from all different seniorities and backgrounds, who was known as that person on the street like, oh, great, I'm driving next to so-and-so, it's going to be a great day. Because you know they're going to get the work done on the street, they can handle things well, etc. So I did 3 focus groups of 22 people, so it's 7, 7, and 8. I asked them the same questions, and surprisingly, they don't know each other well because, as I said earlier, they work isolated. So while you might work out of the same yard, you can be there 20 years and not know anybody, really. So they didn't really know each other. But despite not knowing each other, when I came from that strength space point of view, what would, in your dreams, what do you think could work? Each and every one of them across all 3, it kind of shocked me, all said exactly the same thing, which is we want a way to be able to train new operators the right way to do things and to help them really understand what it truly means to do this job. They could have said anything, right? I mean, we filled, like, at that point, it was still flip chart paper, right? Pages and pages of documentation of what they thought what was wrong, what could be fixed, things like that. But when asked that question, that was what they came up with. And this is where the It's Our Work peer mentoring really emerged, because that's what they wanted. And I went back to the Labor Management Partnership and I said, what do you think? Do you want to try this? And surprisingly, they said yes. So that was the beginning of a worker-initiated change. That made such a huge difference in worker voice, because now they were truly able to express what they thought was going to happen on the job. In order to have these meetings, just to give you a little bit of background, rearranging people's schedules so that you could find somebody all off at the same time on the same day across multiple shifts, while still keeping bus service on the street. Because I'm sure if you've taken public transit, you would not like to hear, by the way, your bus isn't coming because we're having a meeting. So can you wait another hour until your bus comes around? That is just not what we do, right? So services always comes first. Public transit service comes first, but within that, we have to find a way to make these things happen. So it was a really transformative moment for the agency, which we've continued to build on over the past 17 years. These are the longitudinal results we've had over the last 17 years. I'm really shortcutting things here. We have now actually moved a national benchmark from bus driver to professional coach operator. I designed, along with the peer mentors and the company, the new standards, brought that to the Department of Labor. Took a year to get them to approve it because nobody could believe there could be such a thing as a professional coach operator. But once we proved those metrics, which is the second point, then folks were really open to that. The workers themselves, I facilitated them to talk about what it really took to do the job. They designed their own qualitative job metrics, which is, as you know, a difficult thing. The quantitative measures are things like absenteeism, retention, customer complaints. Those are the kind of things that a transit agency will measure, and those are important. The qualitative job metrics were things like, can you juggle multiple priorities on the job? What do you do with difficult passengers? How do you handle disputes over fares? How do you handle conflicts between your personal life, your work life, and your home life, given that your schedule can change so often? How do you handle, that's the kind of qualitative job metrics that the workers design. They use that for their peer mentoring programs. And we've given that metrics for 17 years now across this agency. And you would think after 17 years it would change. They only changed one thing over in 17 years. They added one thing. Actually, they added 2 things. One was cleanliness of the bus operator area, because some operators, because you're never off, right, and you're basically eating while you're on the job, some people didn't quite clean up after themselves. And so that was one they wanted to add. And then the second one came up during COVID, which really had to do more with COVID safety protocols. But if you think about that, for workers to be able to design their own metrics and for the company to validate that, that was a biggest test of worker voice that they've ever had. And I've now used that same approach at other agencies, and it's definitely still an approach that's working. In terms of the measurable improvements, we have lots of metrics, which I'm happy to show at some point: operator retention and absenteeism and service quality. So it wasn't a coincidence that these things were happening, but we were actually tracking them over time. I mentioned the California model. It's called the High Road Training Partnership. California model, it is the workforce development model for the labor agency in the state of California now. It's now attracted also attention from the Department of Labor, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education. A lot of people are looking at what does it mean to bring a high road training partnership that has worker voice in it. And we were one of the pilot projects that helped to prove that concept, and it's now brought to scale across multiple agencies. The biggest thing, though, just to end, is that we've introduced the idea within transit agencies of having relationship-based leadership. And while that's all the rage in management circles and in labor management, how do you, from the leadership point of view, have relationship-based leadership? Trying to solve that in a public sector transit agency with a traditional top-down is pretty difficult. And so I'm not going to say that we have complete success in this. This is basically introducing the concept. At times it works better than others, and it always goes back to the labor management partnership. How is it that that partnership is able to address issues that come up outside of the collective bargaining agreement? It does not replace the collective bargaining agreement. We're very clear that the collective bargaining agreement is sacrosanct. However, this is another tool in the toolbox. And I think this is a tool that we've shown through all these years that in being able to use that labor management partnership and innovate it in the way that we have has brought worker voice more to the forefront. So just to close, this is the session that you referred to earlier, Michael, which is the Breakout Stream 5 on Saturday at 11:15. And we've put together a panel of workers to talk about their own experiences in doing these kinds of partnership work and what it's meant to have worker voice to them. That's basically it for my presentation, unless you'd like to see the video that I'm going to show at Breakout Stream 5, which I don't have time. If people don't have time to see it, it's a 5-minute video, and I don't know if we have time for this, though. I think we're about done. So that's that.
Righty, Deb. Well, thank you so much. I should open it up to brief questions again quickly. John, I'll go to you first if you had any reaction.
No, this sounds super interesting, and I'm working on a series of other kind of higher level things about voice, so it's great to get the actual mechanics in a very concrete situation, especially with workers who are so frequently isolated. I think the one thing I'll throw out there, Deb, if you have any interest, is King County has made this data challenge available that my students are participating in it. So I actually have all this data on the bus routes all over King County to study 2 separate questions. One is about when they removed fares and then reinstated them during COVID.
Yes.
And then another where they have these various incentives, where they have these preloaded transit cards for different groups, and they want to know what effect this has on ridership and so forth. But it seems like there would also be information in the data about the drivers themselves, or at least about the routes and the ridership and how that has changed during the COVID period. So if that's something that's interesting to you, like I have this data sitting here and
great. Yeah, no, let's connect later on. Yeah, King County's one of the most robust systems in the country, so that's a great place to do a study. Santa Clara County, which is where I did this study, is a somewhat of an anomaly because it's somewhat like LA in that sense. It's very car driven, and it's the tech hub, et cetera, et cetera. So the ridership is all over the map. It's quite different than King County in a way in terms of its ability to run its system. Sure, I'd love to see the data at some point.
Thanks for that, John. And Deb, I want to applaud the work in a difficult field to crack into, and as you aptly pointed out, hard to find release time when there are routes to be run and people to be serviced. I was sitting here listening to your presentation and trying to rack my brain and think about places where I've seen worker collectives, worker councils, and primarily it's been in places that are either have a profit motive in the private sector, or in the public sector, it's places that have, had more staffing flexibility, like hospitals and schools. So, being able to get this type of access is great, and applaud your efforts, and thank you for sharing this information with us today.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for joining us on this exciting report on some of the best papers that we've had over the last year here in LERA. I want to encourage folks to return to the full program to find other panels that they can join over the next couple of days, and enjoy the conference. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.